Here's a very important game from round 10 of the FIDE Grand Swiss tournament. Hans Niemann and Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa just a half a point off the leaders. Let's see what happened. Remember, tournament is 11 rounds. So we're getting to the business end. And just remember what's at stake. 2 spots in the candidates. Right, here we go. Niemann with white. It's a Rossolimo. And black always has to be very switched on in this opening because white castles very quickly and black's king is still in the middle. G6, one of the main lines, of course. E5 is a popular move, but I mean, this sacrifice is quite interesting. Again, exploiting the fact that the king is in the middle and takes time to get to the side. But Pragg went for knight d4, which is not the most usual continuation. Niemann exchanges and then c3. Good idea. I think if this pawn is left here, then there's potential to use that c file later. And indeed, you know, black has space with that pawn on d4. So very logical just to try and break down this pawn. And for example, if this is taken, then, you know, white is ready to set up a big center. But e6 instead, Pragg playing very quickly. Knight a3. Niemann took his time over that one, but looks pretty logical. Spinning the knight back to put some pressure here. And again, really black does not want to take here because white can build a big center. A6 from Pragg. Bishop goes back to f1. Yep, nice and tidy. And knight e7. Now Niemann said afterwards that he was a little bit surprised by this move. And he thought this was some very deep preparation from Pragg. It's kind of a nice pawn sacrifice, actually, just to bring the king to safety. And with the pawn still on d2, you know, these pawns actually sort of get in each other's way. And the knight needs to come back into the game, which it did. Knight c2, knight c6. And yeah, the problem for white is that this bishop can't get into play quickly, so that black has good chances of recovering the pawn. But still, it's definitely more comfortable for white, because black is also lagging behind in development on this side of the board. And black still has to get this pawn back. So the knight on d4 you know, physically prevents white from playing pawn to d4. d3, time to get this bishop out. d6, time to get that bishop out. Exchange here. And Niemann pointed out an interesting tactic after the game. He was looking at queen b3 and thought, you know, nice spot for the queen. And, you know, maybe bishop e3 comes afterwards. This pawn is protected. But then he noticed that this move, bishop f2, is actually possible. And queen h4, king steps back, the rook can be taken here. And out of nowhere, black has a really powerful attack. Threatening rook e5, doubling, and maybe rook f5 as well. It's good for black. Very interesting. So he decides to play queen e2. So it defends f2. Also defends b2 so that now the bishop can come into play. Bishop d7. So black is developing as well. And rook e8. So Niemann is still a pawn up. One of those d pawns is an extra one. But it's clear that this one is vulnerable. But also that, you know, black has very easy development here, with the queen potentially coming out to one of these squares, the rook's on the open files. Queen d2, so okay, Niemann has managed to just regroup and develop. And queen f6. Whoops, beg your pardon. Queen f6. Checks the bishop, brings the queen to a nice active square. So, yeah, enough compensation for black. And rook c8. Very often it can be difficult to win a rook ending or a bishop ending with an extra pawn. So, you know, black should be all right in this position. Rook c4. Yep, climbing up the file. So obviously if there's an exchange, then that straightens things out a bit. Bishop takes d3. And rook takes. And queen f5 played. So Pragg looking simply to recapture the pawn. In fact, you know, if you look at this with a computer, it actually suggests just taking here very coolly, even straightening, you know, these pawns a little bit, well, to some extent. And it shows that actually black is doing okay, even in this position, because black's queen is very active. This breaks up the pawns a little bit. And although, yeah, it's a clear extra pawn, in fact, it's very difficult for white to make progress in this kind of position when the king is a little bit exposed and, you know, black's pieces are good, this pawn can advance. Very hard indeed for white to make progress. Look at that bishop as well. It's not the best piece in the world when it's blocked by that pawn on d5. But queen f5 is also reasonable from Pragg. So this pawn is going to be taken, but Niemann understands that actually this kind of transforms his position. You know, in that previous variation with the bishop on c4, it's blocked by the pawn on d5. Now this opens up. White's bishop is very strong. It's better than the bishop on d7. And this is where Pragg starts to drift. So he played queen a5, and it turns out the queen is quite poorly placed here. In fact, queen h5 still maintains some quite nice activity with, you know, there's still potential to come down here. And with black's rook on the open file, in spite of, you know, a move like rook takes. In fact, you know, this is still quite interesting for black to play because, you know, this rook could be a bit offside. You know, all black's pieces are active. But queen a5 looks dubious. And I think Niemann played this part of the game very well indeed. So he exchanged. Queen e1 activates very nicely, threatens the bishop. And bishop d5. And I think this position shows very well that white is on top because this bishop is just fantastic on d5, looking at that potential weak point on f7. Black's queen is not well placed here. King g7. Queen e4. Beautiful centralization. Now, it allows bishop takes d3. So black gets the pawn back. Of course, if queen takes bishop, then queen takes rook. But queen d4 check. And black's best is to play f6. Pragg played this, but that exposes the king. At the moment, the rook is there, but still, it feels very airy. Nice variation. If king h6, then, well, unsurprisingly, with black's pieces across the other side of the board, g4 with the idea g5 is very strong. And if f6, then h4 and, yeah, the threat just to break things open. So f6 forced. And now a cute move, just a3. So protecting the rook. Everything is protected. I mean, that's really nice. And now queen takes bishop is a threat. And Niemann said after the game that he just thought he was winning. Black's king is too weak. And it does look fantastic for white with these beautifully centralized pieces compared to black's. Bishop f5 is still not so clear. One of the ideas behind bishop f5 is that the bishop can fall back and block the rook out, but still, it's, this is still a tremendous position for white, if only by simply playing king g2 and just creeping forward slowly and potentially, g4, g5 or advancing the h-pawn. It's very unpleasant for black, but not yet lost. But after bishop e2, well, this is now getting serious. The bishop is loose, that's one thing, but it simply doesn't connect with the defense, with the king and black's other pieces. h3. So Niemann was proud of this move afterwards. He thought it was important to actually have this square still available for the queen when it comes to attacking. But also this pawn also covers g4 and again stops that bishop coming back to this diagonal. Queen d5, queen e4. So the threat is to play queen e6 and get in on the king. Queen t1 check, king h2. And queen f1 now is a losing move. But this is a very unpleasant position for black. Queen f1, queen e3. So just protecting that pawn. And if the rook moves down, then white gets in there first. You see, weakness of the 7th rank. So bishop b5 played. And now rook e4. So, just compare white's beautifully centralized pieces with black's. They really are scattered to the four corners of the board, actually. Threat to bring the queen in. King h8, queen d4 threatens the pawn, king g7, and now, very cool, rook f4 and f6 caves in, and there is absolutely no defense for black, so Pragg resigned. I think, these last few moves just says everything, that the picture of white's beautifully centralized pieces against Pragg's scattered pieces. Really, really nice game from Niemann. I think it's an interesting example of how Pragg's opening preparation was actually excellent. And probably, I'm guessing that, he had arrived at this position in his prep, roughly around here. And the computer said, yeah, roughly level. Maybe white is a little something, but black has good compensation. But Niemann, wriggled away here. And when Pragg failed to find the most accurate continuation, g3 is very good. And then the game at this point had really turned, and this is fantastic centralization. And I think, although it's not yet lost, I think the writing was basically on the wall. Excellent game from Hans Niemann. So that brings Hans to number 14 in the world on the live rating list, and let's have a look at the scores going into the final round. Well, we've got final round pairings. There are 5 players in the lead on 7 points out of 10. So remember, only 2 spots, qualifying spots for the candidates. We've got Bluebaum playing white against Firuzja. Geary playing white against Niemann. That's going to be a cracker. And Vincent Keimer is the 5th player on 7. He had an epic battle against his compatriot Matthias Bluebaum, but couldn't quite win. So Keim on 7 will play Erigaisi on 6.5. Now, there's a pack of players on 6.5 as well. So it's most likely we're going to get 2 players who are on 7 points qualifying. However, that's still actually wide open if there are draws and players on 6.5 win. I want to point out one player, 15-year-old Andy Woodward on 6.5 points, who defeated Masood Liu in round 10. So he's having an incredible tournament. So I will report back and let you know what happens, but we are set for an epic last round. Join me for my coverage of that. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.